keeps winning. I think the case is in appeal now, so we can maybe get an update on that. William Spruance was at Georgetown University, I think at the time when Brownstone was founded, and then after we published our, 500th paper on vax mandates and masking and everything else, he was protesting against all this nonsense at Georgetown University, and then and got, I think, kicked out of school, unenrolled, right? And then, or more or less. Suspended. Indefinitely suspended, yeah. Part of the Great Purge, and then he just printed out all Brownstone work and delivered a stack of papers this big, and they said, well, that's kind of scary, and so they readmitted him, And now he's practicing law at an undisclosed firm in an undisclosed location, but and does a lot of undisclosed work for Brownstone, actually. So we're going to talk about the law and why perhaps it wasn't there for us. How did this even happen? I mean, we had courts of law. We thought they would protect us, but they weren't there when we wanted them. So now you come to me. That's a line from The Godfather. Anyway, it's a catastrophic institutional failure, as far as I'm concerned, for the courts to have not protected any of our essential liberties. So let's hear from them now. And Bobbie Anne, why don't we start with you with a quick update on where we are on the quarantine case in New York and your plans for expanding this nationwide.
Sure. Can you hear me? Is it working?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Just a show of hands, who's familiar with the quarantine camp lawsuit in New York? Okay, so a good number. For those of you who aren't familiar, there was a regulation that the New York State Department of Health had issued during COVID, and it allowed the Department of Health to pick and choose which New Yorkers they would lock up or lock down. They didn't have to prove you were sick. They didn't have to prove you were exposed to a communicable disease. They could have removed you from your home and put you into a facility of their choosing. You had no say. Or they could have locked you down in your house. They chose how long you would stay locked up or locked down. There was no prohibition on time frame, so it could have been days, could have been weeks, could have been months. There was no provision in the regulation that would allow you to negotiate your freedom. So what I mean by that is when we were at the trial court level last year and we were having oral arguments, the court asked the Attorney General's office, let's say you take a family, let's say you put them into a facility, a hospital, let's say. Once they're in there, how do they get out? And there was a really pregnant pause, and then the Attorney General said, well, I guess they could hire a lawyer and they could sue us. So the regulation had no due process protections. It was an authoritarian rule that the Department of Health, unelected bureaucrats in an agency, had the power over 19 million New Yorkers. So I sued the governor, the Department of Health, the Commissioner of Health, the Health Planning Council, on behalf of a group of New York State legislators, Senator Borrello, Assemblyman Tague, Congressman Lawler, and a citizens group called Uniting New York State. And last summer, we won the case. The court struck down the regulations that it was unconstitutional, and it no longer exists as of today. However, the governor has appealed, so now I'm fighting the appeal. And we just had oral arguments about a month or so ago, and 400 people showed up to oral arguments to support me, and that was pretty amazing because that only happens in the movies. Complete with a standing ovation after I completed my oral arguments, which really made me think, oh my God, these judges are going to kill me. So I rushed very quickly out of the courtroom.
Like a January 6th moment, right?
I was like, oh God, don't clap. So anyway, we're waiting to hear the decision from, it's a five-panel of judge. The judges are all appointed by governors. So pray hard that they do not play partisan politics and will uphold the Constitution. So I'm expecting a decision, could be this month, could be next month, probably be like, right before Christmas.
Isn't it remarkable how governments so predictably appeal every good court decision that comes down? Whether the mask mandate thing or, I think the rent moratorium thing, all the litigation that's gone our way, consistently, governments at all levels are appealing and say, no, that decision went the wrong way.
Well, yes, particularly in New York State, they don't let go of power easily. But what we've seen particularly during the past 3.5 years, but it was happening before then, it's just very obvious now, is this attitude of the government, we know best, we are going to do this because we are taking care of you, we are protecting you, and if you dare to challenge us, we are going to fight back tooth and nail.
Yeah. Based on our, well, let me ask you, William, it's your impression that it seems to be their arguments all come down to we have the right to do whatever we want, and the courts can't restrain executive state.
Yes, and to some extent that's probably to be expected with how our Constitution's written, where an old professor of mine used to say it's the law that governs those who govern us. So if you break the Constitution, it's only ever to infringe on civil liberties. Or the way it's written is, we shall make no law or the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. So anytime you're breaking that, it's inherently the government that's going to be expanding its power.
Explain that a little bit. So you're saying that there's no way to restrain the government from breaking these laws that restrict the government?
Well, that relies fundamentally not on the text in the Constitution, but probably the separation of powers more than anything. I mean, prior to COVID, I was like a lot of people, I assumed what separated us from other countries was this great Bill of Rights that we had. But I mean, the Chinese Constitution guarantees freedom of speech. The Soviet Constitution did too. It didn't help out a ton. So it's not a coincidence that every issue we go up against right now is about eliminating the separation of powers. It's about collusion. It's about centralization. It's about cooperation between people in power, because the only thing to refrain those infringements is going to be some type of a federal system or interagency system that separates those powers. I mean, that's been at the heart of the censorship thing. I mean, it's about consolidating power against people.
That is so interesting. Andrew, speak to the censorship issue, if you would.
Sure. No, it's interesting. Well, when I was asking the law panel, I thought it was LORE, so I'm still kind of grappling with like how I am kind of, we'll see where the conversation goes. It's good to have the mix in there. So, it's interesting because people talked about propaganda and censorship, and in some ways, if people have seen this kind of map of the censorship industrial complex on Racket, that was something that I worked on, and it isn't so much censorship, it's actually kind of this new system of public opinion management, in the sense that, and I think part of the problem was that when COVID came along, people still had essentially the Iraq War, the WMD model of what propaganda looks like. So we're looking for something much more, kind of much more heavy hammer that was kind of obvious to us that we were being lied to, and that we could kind of see through it. Obviously, what happened was something much more sophisticated that took people a lot longer to get their heads around. I think in some ways we've got, obviously people in this room have kind of got the update, so to speak, and I think the general population is starting to get the update a little bit more. I mean, now, when the Twitter files came out, you talk to people about this level of collusion between government and big tech and the intelligence community and NGO and academia, and people be like, oh, no, there's no way that's happening, et cetera, et cetera. And then the counter became, well, yeah, we knew that was happening. It's like, no, you didn't. But you didn't know it was happening at all, actually. You said that anyone who said that was a conspiracy theorist, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think we have kind of updated, to a degree, like what that kind of new propaganda model or public opinion management system is, but there's a huge amount more to unpack and understand in terms of just how integrated those systems are and the level of organic versus inorganic manipulation that is going on, because you have a culture that is obviously become increasingly censorious, but you also have authorities that have hijacked or kind of decided to weaponize that kind of culture and egg it on to make use of it strategically. But I think you don't need to work out the exact percentage of what that is, but I think you do need to understand what the dynamics are between one and the other in order for us to, dismantle it, ultimately.
Yeah, the big picture, as I'm gathering here, is that the Constitution says the government can't infringe on people's free speech rights. And now, after a couple of hundred years go by, you've got, finally government figures out that there are ways around it, just by paying other people, by finding pressure points within the culture and the population, technology and media and so on. You can achieve the same results without such brutal methods.
But is that new? Governments going around the law is not new.
Right.
I think what's new is the sophistication of this kind of complex and how integrated it is, how much coordination there is between the various different elements of philanthropy, media, NGO, academia, tech, government. That's the new thing to me, and the shift from managing broadcast media into managing this kind of online environment. I think that's the difference. I mean, tell me if I'm wrong. The government has always ratted around the law to the degree in which it's able to.
Coming out of World War I, we jailed journalists and people who protested the war. We jailed Eugene Debs. He had to run for president from prison, which might become fashionable again. I don't know. But to your point, and Oliver Wendell Holmes, a supposedly liberal jurist, upholds all these in 3 court decisions in 1919 and 1920. So that's coming out of the Wilson administration. And so that urge has always been there for power to consolidate itself and perpetuate itself. And that's not new, but I think you're probably spot on that it's the means and the reach of that and the technological advances that have allowed it to become so much more pernicious.
Yeah, it's the affordances and what they afford.
Yeah.
And one of the things that, and we talked about this at the retreat, that strikes me about the censorship issue is not just merely to control what you read and what you can say, but ultimately about what you can do. Because, for example, and I'm sure you know this agency called CISA, which is very much involved in the censorship, which I didn't know until you explained this to me. I knew the agency as famous for the agency that in one day decided to break the whole American workforce into essential and non-essential. It was the same agency. Those censoring social media posts was the same one that intervened so directly and brutally in the workforce. So this is all connected, right? So you control the way people think, and then you manage their lives too. Which
they tell you that they're doing it for your good on your behalf.
Yeah.
While they do it, it just always happens to benefit them as well. I mean,
right.
The famous example coming out of those World War I cases that many of you probably heard of, at the origin of shouting fire in a crowded theater. That's how they justified putting these people in jail. So it was sort of this weird derision that was meant to make it sound like it was trying to help you from these people causing chaos, because then you'd get trampled running out of the theater or something like that. And so it's a similar tactic today, right? We're helping you by not letting you read this, by not letting you hear this, by not letting you see this.
I just want to follow on a little bit on the CISA item, because I think that was also something that I was totally shocked about, that CISA essentially divided up the labor force and essentially oversaw who was essential and not.
And these were strange times, because you really did have to read a PDF from human resources in your company or your local government to find out if you were essential or not. And it wasn't clear whether you were entitled to make your own judgment about your essentiality, you know? And if you were wrong, what would happen, right? Nobody really knew. It was just such chaotic times.
But then I had come at it a completely different angle, and was that where CISA came up in the work that I was doing, and Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi and others, was that this was one of the core agencies that interface between academia and NGOs in terms of, the election integrity project. There were strong links to the Plurality project. To Alex Stamos, who is the head of Stanford Internet Observatory, formed a new business with Chris Krebs, who used to head up CISA, as I understand it, as well. We both kind of participated in things through the Aspen Institute. So there's this whole kind of complex coordination cabal, however you want to say it, that relates both to very concrete things like dividing up the workforce and public opinion management.
Same things. This agency was only founded in 2018, right? Right? Yes, correct. Yes, I was asking. Yes, that's when it was founded. And the first head of it was just this Jen Easterly. It was pulled out of the National Security Agency, which is the one that Edward Snowden had said, was spying all Americans, which is an outgrowth of the CIA, basically. Right. So basically, you had the CIA. A division of the CIA dividing up the American workforce and censoring all the social media posts. So I don't know what else you want to call this except a coup d'etat. I mean, that's ultimately what happened, it seems to me. And then part of this is this the attempt, and that New York legislation about the quarantine laws was probably intended, don't you think, to be passed nationwide, don't you think?
I think that if New York got away with having a regulation, because the whole premise of my lawsuit against the governor was separation of powers. The governor is the executive. The Department of Health is part of the executive branch, and they don't have the power to make law. And what that regulation was really a law. And there's a test in New York that the courts go through to decipher the difference between a regulation and a law. That was clearly a law. And the other thing is, every state in the nation does have a quarantine law. We've had one in New York since 1953. So you do have these laws, but for example, in New York, the quarantine law, not the regulation that the Department of Health made, the law is full of due process protections so that the government can't abuse its power and abuse its citizens. And that's why we have laws made by the legislature, because you elect your legislative representatives, you elect your senators, you elect your assembly members at the federal level, you elect your Congress members in the Senate, because they make the laws. And if you don't like the laws that they're making, you can vote them out, and you vote somebody else in who's going to mind the Constitution and support the Constitution. Agencies in the executive branch, executives, whether it's the governor or the president at the federal level, they don't get to make law. Our Constitution is very clear. They do not make the laws. They enforce the laws that are made by the legislature. So you can't have, and it's very logical, you can't have unelected bureaucrats sitting in an agency somewhere making a rule that conflicts with a law, conflicts with the Constitution. That's tyranny. That is tyranny. When one branch of government takes a power that they are not entitled to, that is the pure definition of tyranny. And what we saw in New York was Department of Health made a rule that conflicted with our quarantine law. The number one thing, step one in our quarantine law in New York State, is that you have to actually have the disease that they think you have. Okay, that's step one. The doctor has to say, yes, this person has tuberculosis, right? Step two is then there's an investigation by the local Department of Health, not the state, the local Department of Health, to see not only does this this person have the disease, but are they comporting themselves in a manner that's improper? Are they going around sneezing on everybody, or going in the store and licking the soda cans or something? Are you doing things that are going to spread your germs and harm other people? There's an investigation. You have the right to an attorney, which the rule that the governor and the Department of Health made said you got the right to an attorney after you were locked up, not before. So the law says, no, you have the right to an attorney. There's a hearing before a judge, a third party, impartial judge gets to hear the evidence against you. You have an attorney defending you. And then the judge can decide. The judge, not the Department of Health, can decide whether or not you should be isolated or quarantined for however much time. But it's a two-pronged test. One, you have the disease, and two, you are not comporting yourself in a proper manner to safeguard those around you. And then the judge can issue an isolation or quarantine order to put you into a facility, a hospital, so that you can get treatment and get better, right? It's all very logical. Imagine that. And agencies cannot come along and write a rule, also called a regulation, that conflicts with laws. They don't have that power. They can't possibly have that power because we can't elect them in and out and tell them to go take a hike. Sorry, you're not making my laws anymore. So it's all very logical. Our founding fathers were brilliant. I mean, the Constitution is not perfect, but it is brilliant. And think about it. It's because they came from tyranny. They lived under a tyrannical king for years, and they had no voice, and they were being overtaxed, and they felt like, what are we doing? This guy's not listening to us. We have no representation whatsoever. And they broke free. They started our country. They wrote our Constitution such that if it was followed properly, which it's not being followed, if it was followed, we would never have tyranny on these shores again. But here we are 250 years later, and we are literally fighting tyranny.
Is one difference not that people have learned to love tyranny?
You're being very prophetic right now, Andrew.
No, because when you said X, Y, and Z is tyranny, I was thinking, yes, and that people either don't care or egg it on. They're happy with it. They prefer it, actually. It's calming, it's soothing. It's the world is the dangerous, confusing place. They'd rather have tyranny. And that's actually even more terrifying. Sorry to be down. I think some people were. That seems to me actually the biggest challenge. If you think about law, where did the lawyers go? And when people have been asking this question about where did the journalists go, where did everybody go? But one question is where did the lawyers go? And if you think about the censorship stuff, a lot of the NGOs and the academics, there's plenty of lawyers in there, and they became part of the apparatus. They were very happy to be part of the apparatus. So, for example, there's something called the Berkman Center for Internet Society at Harvard Law School, which is probably my only tenuous actual connection to the law. Where I was there as a fellow for a couple of years, and they had they still have an initiative called Rebooting Social Media, which explicitly on the website says that they're bringing together NGOs and academia and the intelligence community, because community sounds nice and friendly, and et cetera, et cetera. And out in the open, they have done and doing this work to bring those elements together through, I guess, the crisis, or what they perceive as the crisis of the election of Trump, the kind of crisis of the elites. And so people have willingly participated in this work. And so, emails that I saw through the Twitter files that most shocked me were, election tabletop, not the Hunter Biden one, but another one, where you had these .mil, .West Point, etc. emails with .Harvard, etc. with NGOs, etc. having. Why were they having a meeting? Why do academics and NGOs, sorry to go down conspiracy land, why were academics and the military having a meeting to, do an exercise prior to the election? That doesn't seem normal to me. Of course, there's always been integration between the intelligence community, etc., particularly during the Cold War and academia. But this was kind of different, and this seemed to come out of the kind of panic of the election of Trump, that now it was okay, particularly for most of these people who identify as kind of liberal, left progressive, to kind of cast off the old kind of enemies of the FBI, etc., who were oppressing the new left left, etc., and actually now embrace them with open arms and say, actually, we're so terrified of the barbarians over there that we're happy to kind of make friends with you again in order to kind of make sure this doesn't happen again.
And this is a serious problem with the legal profession itself today, right? I mean, Bobbie Anne Cox pursued this case in New York pro bono, just on your own. You were doing property taxes before. You became a Brownstone Fellow. It's enabled you to pursue your litigation, that sort of thing. And I think about the other cases. So many of the law cases that have gone in our direction have been brought by, not big shots, but just regular attorneys who are doing something else, who decided to just step up and do something on behalf of human dignity and human rights.
I can speak to that.
Yeah.
As soon as Andrew Cuomo, who was our governor in March of 2020 when COVID came to New York, as soon as he said, everybody locked down, 2 weeks to flatten the curve, the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I was like, oh, no. First of all, you can't do that. Second of all, it's not just going to be 2 weeks, right? Because I've been suing the government, for tax surcharge cases for a couple decades, and I said, the government doesn't work that fast. No, this is not going to just be 2 weeks. So it turned into months, right? And from day one, I was like, no, guys, listen, hey, they can't do this. This is unconstitutional. But as you call them, the big shots, right? I mean, first of all, the civil rights organizations all disappeared.
Yeah. ACLU was all for vaccine mandates and so on.
Yeah, which is, they have attorneys in there. But when we had, this past March, we had the first, they called it the COVID litigation conference, and it was basically a conference of attorneys that was held in Atlanta, Georgia, and attorneys came from all over the country to hear those of us that are on the front lines, fighting against the tyranny and whatever, and to try and, get involved and get into it, and it was the CLE and all this stuff. And at one point, my colleague Jeff Childers, who's a civil rights attorney down in Florida, was on stage, and he said, in the room full of about 700 attorneys, he said, raise your hand if you are in a law firm with 100 or more attorneys. And only a couple of hands went up in the audience. And then he went down and he said, okay, raise your hand if you're in a law firm that has, 50 to 100 attorneys. And then a few more hands went up. And then he said, raise your hand if you are a solo practitioner or in a law firm with 20 or fewer attorneys. And the whole room raised their hands. And so that tells you a lot about where we are today. Because I reached out to, I can't count how many colleagues before I filed the quarantine case, because, I said, first of all, help me, because it'll take less time, it'll be quicker and more efficient if we have more attorneys, or do the case yourself, here it is, right? No one would touch it. No one would touch it, which is why I ended up doing it myself pro bono. Yeah. No one would touch it, and it's a testament to where we are in society today.
It's just simply because there's no money in fighting the state.
Well, one, there's no money in, civil rights. Typically, you are fighting the government, right? So there's not money in that, but I think also that it takes a certain personality, because you will. I was shunned by my colleagues. Why are you doing this, Bobbie Anne? First of all, it's going to pass. It's going to pass. Don't worry about it. Just, ride it out. Why are you going to push back against the machine? You're going to lose your practice, which I had, for 20 years, built up my practice after leaving a large international law firm. I had my own practice for 20 years. You spent your whole, the past 20 years building up this. Why are you going to risk that? Just sit back, keep your mouth shut. It's going to pass. And I said, there's no way that I'm going to sit back and watch this happen. They are destroying. And I have to say, people always say, like, what made you do this? because I was in real estate, I used to sue the government on behalf of property owners if I felt that their valuations were unjust and the government was overstepping in that manner. But, you know, what I saw was one of the first things they did was a nationwide, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, issued a nationwide eviction moratorium. Okay, are bells going off in your head right now? And what that resulted in was tenants across the nation, not all, many, stopped paying their rent because they knew they couldn't get evicted because the government told them you can't get evicted. So landlords were reaching out to me desperate because because they couldn't hold on to their properties. And most landlords in our country are mom and pop shops. So it's people that have saved up, you know, life savings, worked hard, bought a property, maybe it's a 2-family, maybe it's a 5-family, whatever. They live in part of the house and then they rent out the other sections of the property. And that's how they pay their bills, and that's how they feed their children, and that's how they pay. So when your tenants stop paying rent, you know, I was getting calls, emails, people coming to my door and knocking on my office door during COVID when you're not supposed to be out. Please help me. I'm losing my property. I can't pay my mortgage. I can't pay my property taxes. I can't pay my insurance. I can't pay the maintenance on the property because my tenants stopped paying me rent. So I was seeing people lose their life savings. And I was so angry, and I said, you know what? COVID might be terrible, but I'm not a doctor. I don't see that. What I see as an attorney is the government causing such strife for their people, and they're not allowed to do it. It's unconstitutional. They're not allowed to do it, and I had to get involved. I had to step in, and I had.
And the Supreme Court struck that down, right?
This, a year and a half later, the Supreme Court struck it down. A year and a half later.
We can't live like this, honestly.
No. It's defense.
The freedom can't survive under these conditions where we're in litigation for 1, 2, 3 years to get a court that says, oh, the government's gone too far. And then the agency does it again because there's no real penalties.
That's right.
So listen, I don't want to say anything. Cheer us up. You're young and optimistic.
Cheer us up.
I mean, look at you. I mean, you're in law. You're out there to make a difference. What are you going to do?
The weight on my shoulders. I mean, just to add on to the pessimism, what worries me also, I mean, the question is sort of like the factors that Bobbie Anne just talked about, to some extent, are like who's autonomous to take this action. That's when the small firms came in, and then who's willing to take on the social risk of it. And one of the issues you see with young attorneys is that they have $200,000 in student loans, and so they're not really free to take on a case that they want to because they have no real autonomy. They're not particularly able to take on those tasks, and so people wonder why people are scared into silence all the time. Why weren't I started law school in fall 2019. And I left for spring break in March 2020 and didn't go back for a while, for a year and a half. And when all this was happening, I was sort of shocked of why, and this wasn't just at law school, more generally, why weren't more young people stepping up? Like, where was the punk rock attitude or the Berkeley 1968 rebel spirit? It was sort of strange, especially within 6 weeks when we realized it probably wasn't going to affect us. Like, let's at least be selfish, you know, why don't we keep on living life? And I kept thinking it was going to come, and it never really did. It still hasn't, certainly. And I think part of that was just that people are not truly free to speak up and say what they want because of the ramifications. If they are all of a sudden unable to get a job or something like that, they have crippling debt, they can't afford a house, they can't afford to be autonomous in their decision making. And so the economics and the freedom point aren't totally decoupled here. And so that's something we probably need to figure out, is how do we empower people to act on behalf of these causes? If the power is consolidating like we see it is, how do we make it so that they can stand up against that? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we're grateful for your efforts, Bobbie Anne and William. Andrew, for all you're doing. Let me finish this with one final question here. And it's something that's concerned me. Well, I guess it's the oldest question in political philosophy, which is, how do you restrain states that are determined to ignore the written restraints on them? I worry about this with Missouri Biden. What happens if this case goes our way? Ultimately, is it enforceable with a government that's determined to be tyrannical? Well, let me ask it a different way. Can we rely on technical legal fixes in absence of a dedicated public consensus for freedom and rights?
So that's a great question, because what you'll see, and what we did see during COVID, but the courts react to public opinion. Yeah. And if the public is scared and the public is okay with the government saying, wear a mask, take a shot, don't leave your house, only 10 people at your Thanksgiving dinner, if the public is okay with that, the courts are going to say, okay, all right. If the public is not okay with that, the courts are going to say, well, hang on a second, we got the Constitution here, you can't do this, right? And what we need to do is, the government has become this catch me if you can attitude. They know they can't do something, they do it anyway, and they say, come get me if you can, come sue me. If you win, maybe I'll stop. If you don't win, I'm just going to keep doing this. I'm going to take this power that I gave myself. The people didn't give it to me. I gave it to myself, and I'm going to keep going with it. So bringing lawsuits is not the ultimate answer, because we are on defense if we just keep bringing lawsuits. We have to change the leadership who is making the laws, who is appointing the agency heads, and who is then, those agency heads, hiring the people beneath them. We have to change the leadership. That's how we get out of this mess.
And change the public opinion that leads to the leadership.
Definitely, definitely.
Yeah.
That is the
Andrew, do you want to add to anything to this?
Yeah, I mean
you're from the great country that's so good at restraining the government.
Although we did just restrain the government a couple of weeks ago,
yes.
So maybe there's in our referendum, which is
that's
a matter of hope there. But I think again, I actually think these things are the norm. I think governments will always attempt to take more power for themselves. The terrifying thing is that the public has allowed it or actually encouraged government. I mean, my understanding of the story for Britain, for example, was that there were opposing lockdowns at the start, but somehow the public were clamored into a frenzy, built into a frenzy to say, no, please, lock us in our homes. We really want to stay here. So that's the super.
We're all in this together.
Yeah, that's the really, really dangerous thing. So where is the punk rock attitude? And it was the people on the left, which is historically where I was from, or am, or who knows where I am. But it's so confusing today. That used to be the ones who were saying, question authority, no to the government, limits on government power. And I think that was the turnkey. I actually think that the fact that the progressives collapsed, so obviously that had been a long time in the coming, and egged on the government and joined hands with it along with big tech and the media, etc. That's the worst thing for me about it all, and that's why I'm so concerned about how the kind of pushback and the lack of a kind of strong public that is it's working in opposition to this new regime.
But it's tied into the censorship issue.
Oh, it's completely tied into it. So I mean, in some ways you can take the censorship as a compliment, because it does at least mean that they know that if you did have all the information about what was going on, you would not buy into it, or at least a large number of people would not buy into it. So censorship, in some ways, we can be flattered by the idea that they do. I mean, I think you only censor when you're in a weak position, when you're scared that if people have the other information, they will not follow you on what you're doing. So that thank you for kind of raising the spirits of the room.
Aaron, do you have a final word?
I think that's true. The point of censorship isn't just about restraining the speaker, it's about making sure you can't hear what they have to say. Julian Assange isn't in prison because he's good with computers. He's in prison because you're not allowed to know the truth about what they're doing overseas in a foreign war. And that's true on the Missouri v. Biden case, Berenson v. Biden, all of these cases. I guess we should take it as a compliment that they think they need to lie to us because they know that maybe we'd say something more against it. And I guess as long as we can still have meetings like this and we can still talk to each other and we can still fight back, there's hope. I guess there's the optimism.
Good. Well, we'll leave it there and prepare for our science panel. We'll do a similar thing. Okay? Thanks, Shepard. Appreciate it. Well, my mother's here.